everybody. Welcome back to CMN 153. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 19th of July, where I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to media studies before we actually get into analysis of media itself. So I still view this as kind of introduction. And we began the introduction last class where I reviewed the syllabus and the course outline, and I asked you to introduce yourselves, and thank you very much for answering that discussion forum question. Very much enjoyed reading about all of you. So I indicated you're not required to respond to your classmates, but I do ask that you read all of your classmates' responses and my responses to your classmates, and it would be very similar to what you would hear in a live class. And if you did decide to respond, it would be very similar to your raising your hand. And this is what I count for attendance for these particular classes. One thing I didn't get a chance to talk about last class in the syllabus was about plagiarism. So I just wanted to briefly discuss that. I'm sure plagiarism is a term you've heard from other instructors in other classes. It's basically using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. And that's the key, not acknowledging the source. Because if you do acknowledge the source and give credit to that source, then you are conducting research, which is exactly what we expect you to do in college. But when you don't acknowledge the source, the implication is that you are the source, and that's deceptive. And we actually call it intellectual theft, and that you are taking somebody else's ideas or language and you're not giving them credit. It's a pretty serious offense. If you were to get caught doing it, you could, from anywhere, fail the assignment to actually be expelled from college with a notation on your transcript that the reason why you were expelled is because you plagiarized. So it's pretty serious. And I always give two stories about plagiarism to try to encourage students not to plagiarize. One actually happened to me in the early days of my career, so this would be in the early 1990s. So I didn't have the internet to rely upon. And I don't know if you're aware of this, as many resources that exist to help students plagiarize, there are an equal number of sources online to help teachers determine if students are plagiarizing. One of my favorites is called Turnitin.com, where basically I can put in a sentence or a paragraph and do a database search for the site of origin. But basically, I didn't have any of that. I had to rely on my own memory. And I'm reading a paper. It sounds familiar. Not that surprising because teachers tend to be pretty well read. So I just had to contemplate where had I seen this before. Again, I couldn't rely on the internet. And it didn't take me too long, though, where I had seen this before, because it was from our own class textbook that this person had actually plagiarized from one of our assigned readings. With a few mechanical errors here and there. I'm not sure if they were trying to, in one way or another, deceive me, if I saw a few mechanical errors, or if they just were slopping and recopying. But at any rate, that's my story. But the better story, which happened around the same time period, so also pre-internet, but it didn't happen to me. It happened to a middle-aged professor, and this part is important, the middle-aged professor, so keep this in mind. He's reading a set of papers. Again, he can't rely on the internet, and he just knows that he's reading a paper that sounds familiar. And he's thinking to himself, where have I read this before? Where have I read this before? And then it occurs to him, he hadn't read it. He had written it years earlier when he was an undergraduate student. It was one of his old papers. And I'm not sure of all of the details, but it had something to do with a fraternity where they were recycling old papers. And somehow, some way, this poor student got a hold of the teacher's old paper and submitted it in to his own instructor. I mean, what are the chances? So those are my two stories to encourage you not to plagiarize. We're talking about a subject, though, that I hope encourages you as well not to plagiarize, because it's a subject that is something that impacts all of us, media. And it's something that we are completely and totally surrounded by, media. And certainly we'll do readings about media, and certainly we will talk about media, but I'm most interested in your own experiences with media. I think that's really where the heart of the class happens to be. So, and learning how to interpret media from a critical or an analytic perspective. And that's what the two readings were that I had assigned today as kind of introduction. I'm well aware that students are still adding and dropping classes. You might not necessarily have had a chance to get the textbook. So if you didn't do the reading, for this particular class, that's fine because I see this as introduction. We'll actually start to get into the actual media itself next class. But the first chapter that I had assigned, which was tellingly called Chapter 1, was about mass media and mass communication. And what I wanted to do was to lay out some definitions about what mass media and mass communication is. So the first definition is about communication, and this is about the sending and receiving of messages. So you have a sender and you have a receiver. And when we talk about media, we're talking about channels or ways of communicating. This could be a book. It could be a newspaper. It could be a magazine. It could be a radio. It could be a movie. It could be television. It could be music. It could be gaming. And in fact, we'll talk about all of those elements of media as the semester progresses, that this is a way that you can communicate, whether it be one-to-one or one-to-many, or both. And then ultimately, social media, which I think we're all very familiar with in the last 10 or 15 years, and the explosion of social media, online forms of communication. I'm old enough to remember when the internet began, and we were talking about the internet as the information superhighway, that it was basically going to be a way to access information. We didn't really realize at the time the kind of social opportunities, both positive and negative, that the internet would be providing for us. And for better or worse, we are all involved in social media. So that's one of the major ways that we need to think about media from a critical perspective, not just for ourselves personally, but for ourselves as a society. Now, one of the things that you've probably noticed, or at least you've intuited, is that we have experienced media convergence in the last couple of decades or so, which basically forms of media that were individual entities, like books and magazines and newspapers, are all accessible on the internet. As one of the ways that the internet has helped to transform media and media studies, which leads to some problems, because usually we would name media after the mode of communication. So television was a program that was seen over a television set. That isn't necessarily the case anymore, where we've got things like streaming and we've got things like smartphones. It could still be considered television because it's made for that media, but obviously we're accessing it in lots of different ways. So we're in a kind of brave new frontier when it comes to media and media studies. And as much as media has been changed by the internet, I suspect this is only just the beginning, especially when we hear conversations about things like artificial intelligence, Facebook becoming meta, and thinking about the creation of alternate realities. So, more definitions. Popular, because after all, this class is about media and popular culture. Popular is supported by the masses, large groups of people. More often than not, that's usually seen as something that's negative if large groups of people are supporting or interested in a particular kind of thing. Culture. And there's two ways to think about culture. Oftentimes we talk about culture in terms of the arts, whether we have high culture, things like oftentimes we use names like Shakespeare, or we use names like Bach, and low culture. And this is where we talk about the masses, and that this is perhaps something that is of interest to large groups of individuals. And this is where I think that sometimes there can be a certain level of elitism. I think that sometimes high culture can be low culture. If you know anything at all about Shakespeare, you know that Shakespeare wrote for the masses, all levels of society. It was the television of the day, even though we think of it as high culture today. And I think that you can take things that are considered low culture, magazines and advertisements and movies, and examine them from an academic perspective. I've oftentimes argued that one television program in particular, if you've ever seen it, Breaking Bad, is just a phenomenal example of how something that is popular, they can also be high culture. It really is the story of Oedipus the King, if you know anything about literary tradition, about a man experiencing downfall because of outside forces and also flaws with character. It's just a modern day retelling of the great Greek drama, Oedipus the King by Sophocles. Um, that's not to say that everything on television has that kind of validity to it, and that kind of depth and sophistication. But I think that what we will see in this class is that we can examine things from an academic perspective that were never really necessarily created to be examined from an academic or a critical thinking perspective. They were meant to basically entertain and generate profit. And Shakespeare also meant to entertain and generate profit, but yet there was also an additional level there. And even if there isn't an additional level, we can learn a great deal about our culture. And this is where I use the second definition of the word. In the most general sense, culture is any group membership. And I suppose we could debate whether two individuals make a group or if that's just a pair. But definitely, once we get to three or more individuals, that's a group. Any group membership, because within that group, there are predictive qualities associated within that group for behaviors, the way that group will act, for attitudes, the emotional responses of that group, for beliefs, what that group thinks is true and false, and for values, which encompasses all of those, and those are very highly resistant to change. Now, that said, we have to be careful not to stereotype and assume that everybody within the group is going to have the same behaviors and attitudes and beliefs and values. But chances are, if you are part of that particular group, then there probably are some commonalities between group members. And usually, when we talk about cultures, we talk about large group memberships, things that are very visible, things like gender, for instance, or ethnicity, for instance, or political affiliation, for instance. But it could be much more specialized. It could be based on a hobby, on a geographic region. For better or worse, our class is a culture. We are a group that is sharing an experience together, and we will develop behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and values that, again, may not necessarily be indicative of everyone in our class or our group, but also can be indicative on some levels of how the group functions, not just necessarily how the individuals function as well. So if you've ever been in a class where you can kind of predict this is going to be a talkative class or this is going to be a quiet class based on past behaviors of a group of individuals within that larger group, then you know what I'm talking about in terms of the idea of the predictive element of culture. When we talk about popular culture, we're talking about the beliefs, the attitudes, the values of large masses, large groups of people. And again, that's usually viewed as low culture because large groups of people are basically supporting something. And again, I think that's somewhat elitist, especially when you think of the context of Shakespeare. Though I guess there is something to be said about the idea of the lowest common denominator. And I think we've seen that in many of our media. The idea of trying to earn quick profit and superficial entertainment without providing much else. But even in those situations, there are messages embedded about what we value as a people or what we should value as a people. So, postmodern culture, which is oftentimes what our culture is called, which is sort of a poor term because post means after our contemporary culture. So what's going to come next? Postmodern, I'm not sure. But that our culture is based on populism, what appeals to the quote ordinary unquote person. Though again, I'm not necessarily sure how to define ordinary. There's a great quote that I oftentimes use that normalcy is a majority concept. Normalcy is a majority concept. I talk about this actually in my horror film class with the text I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, which is where that quote comes from. But I think it's applicable on so many levels in terms of what we consider to be the norm or the abnormal in our society, that which is against what is determined to be norm. our postmodern culture is also about diversity, and not necessarily just about the idea of political diversity, but just fragmentation, or social diversity, but fragmentation. Lots of different cultural groups. If you think about it, we all belong to hundreds, if not thousands, of cultural groups. And then nostalgia, this sentimental yearning for the past. Things were better back in the day. And also paradox, the seeming contradiction of things within a culture. And those cultures tell us narratives, stories about what we value as a people and what we value as individuals. That's what we are going to be studying this semester. The stories and messages about the behaviors, the attitudes, and the beliefs and values. And also we learn about the ethics, the moral principles based on media. So what we think is ethical or what we think is not ethical in terms of media. And then we form certain levels of conclusion based on all of this. Now, this is all based on the idea of media literacy, which is what this class and other media studies classes try to do. Trying to understand how mass media, again, those vehicles of communications that are consumed and used by large groups of people, influence us and influence others. And the way to go about it from an academic perspective would be very similar to how you would go about analyzing a piece of literature. And that first you have to describe, document what's happening. And then you have to analyze and identify patterns. And then you have to interpret to come up with possible meanings. And then you have to evaluate, make some sort of an informed judgment based on that. And if you wanted to motivate your audience to engage in some sort of action, some sort of active involvement, that would be the time to do so. However, you can also do this from a scientific perspective as well, which is what Chapter 15 was about. Media effects and research, and how media studies became a kind of academic discipline. So using scientific inquiry as a way to study the effects of mass media on individuals and society. So you would use basically the scientific method. If you've ever taken a science class, you know exactly what that is. That first you identify a problem, and then you review the existing research based on that problem. And then you develop a working hypothesis for trying to solve that problem. And then you determine an appropriate measurement method. You collect the data, you analyze the results. And then ultimately, you form a conclusion again. Now, you can see that in the notes below this video, this is where I am posting basically the main points of this particular video. And you can see that under that section, which is section 2, we've also got some things that we need to consider that could influence or in one way or another contaminate our results. And while this is perhaps more important for a scientific analysis in a laboratory, it also is important for analysis that is more subjective outside of a laboratory. We have to think about, is this research objective? Are we eliminating bias? And the sad fact is there's always bias. There is no scientific experiment that has no bias whatsoever. You want to try to reduce bias as much as possible. Is it reliable? Can it be duplicated? Can it be repeated? Is it valid? Does it measure what it claims to measure? And in the 1920s is when media studies became a kind of academic discipline. And there were lots of different ways to go about media studies. One was called propaganda analysis, where basically individuals would measure and interpret the deliberate spreading of messages to influence and control others. Usually it was through governments spreading messages to try to influence and control others, though not necessarily solely through that. And that's still a valid study of media today. Public opinion research, that instead what you do is you take surveys from respondents and then you measure and interpret that data. So if you are familiar with USA Today, they do that quite frequently. Or the idea of even class evaluations at the ending of a semester, trying to get the respondents of a class to give their particular opinion. There also is social psychological research. Notice how often other academic disciplines play a role in media literacy and media studies. So there's a good amount of psychology and there's a good amount of sociology, as well as science and history that can be applied. So the idea that media studies can be quite interdisciplinary. But if you know anything about psychology, which is the behavior of individuals, and if you know anything about sociology, which is the behavior of large groups of individuals or cultures, you can merge the two together so that you can measure and interpret the behaviors and the thoughts of individuals within the context of a larger group or society. That's another way that we can view media and how media influences us from a social psychological perspective. Or marketing research. So if you're interested in business, they're analyzing media for measuring and interpreting consumer buying habits. Or a content analysis, and that would be very similar to what you might do in a literature class, where you measure and interpret the textual messages. And media gives us messages not just in written text, but in visual and audio text as well, so you can interpret all of the above. Now, the effects of media on an individual, and keep in mind that I'm oversimplifying, that this could be something that we could talk about all semester long, but instead I just wanted to spend a little bit of time giving you an overview before we begin to actually talk about the media itself. There is the hypodermic effects model, that media influences users, that we are passive receptacles, and basically media will influence us. The idea that if we watch too much violent media, for instance, that we ourselves become violent because we play too many video games, let's say. And there's probably some truth to that. But there's also the minimal effects model, that we selectively choose the media that we consume. So you may not watch video games, that there's a certain, or play video games, that there's a certain kind of temperament and personality attracted to that particular form of media. So there is a certain amount of control. We aren't just passive receptacles. The uses gratification model, that we choose media that's going to satisfy our emotional and intellectual needs. So if we are a heavy media user, let's say, of social media, it's because we are trying to reach out for community, for some sort of connection. Social learning media, or social learning theory, I should say, that media influences behavior. If you know some of the famous psychology studies with the Bobo doll, that again, exposing children to lots of violent television would result in children acting out with Bobo dolls by hitting these dolls that were basically these large dolls that would fall to the floor and then they would rise up, they would Bobo back and forth. They were based on some sort of a balancing element. So there is a certain truth to that, again, but not everyone who watches violent television shows is going to respond violently. So media doesn't always influence behavior. And again, media might attract individuals from certain kinds of behavioral schools. So that also needs to be taken into account when we think about, is it valid? Is it claiming to measure what it claims to measure? Agenda setting theory, that the media determines the topics of importance, or what we think about or what we don't think about. So in other words, the topic of importance now is the recent wedding between J-Lo and Ben Affleck, not necessarily the war that is undergoing, that is under progress now. So and I think there is a certain amount of truth to that media determines what we talk about and also what we don't talk about. So it's not just determining what's there, but what's missing. Cultivation effect theory, that media influences our perceptions. In fact, this is something that we're going to be talking about over the course of this semester, that we oftentimes claim that we are not subject to the influences of media, and yet the way we see the world is very much shaped by media. Of course, media also reflects the way we shape the world, so there's a little bit of the chicken and the egg there. Political economy studies, that media is intertwined with economics and politics. Think about how Twitter has become so embroiled in political conversation, for instance, just as an example. Or a third person effect, again, what I was suggesting earlier, that believing that others are more influenced by media and that we ourselves are not influenced by media. And We will read about multiple studies, as well as we will read about general concepts with media. We'll also be watching a number of videos associated with media that illustrate all of these points. And that spiral of silence that I was suggesting about, that media determines not just what we talk about, but what we don't talk about. And also that individuals are very hesitant to share minority opinions. Think about how this works with social media, because you don't want to be seen as the outsider. So these are just some of the elements to consider about media as we begin to study media in a bit more depth next class. And I thought that today's attendance question could be about media in general, and probably would have been one of the most significant events, if not the most significant event in our lifetimes, COVID-19. How do you think COVID-19 has influenced mass media, and why? How do you think COVID-19 has influenced mass media, and why? And basically, you can see there's no right or wrong answer to this question. I'm more interested in the conversation and more interested in the debate. And the next class, we begin by analyzing media. And I wanted to start with advertising and public relations, because I really think that is the element that all media vehicles share: advertising, marketing, and public relations. And then what I try to do was to put the media that we'll be studying in chronological order, though this can be kind of tricky, because as I indicate, the internet has basically absorbed all media. So I thought we would begin with the media, or begin with the internet, I should say, and then try to analyze media from a chronological perspective, talking about books, for instance, and then magazines and newspapers. But then you've got those outliers like music that probably has existed since the beginning of time. I put that towards the ending of the semester rather than towards the beginning of the semester. But basically, what we will be doing is each class is examining a form of media or a form of communication and how that has influenced us and influenced others and our society as a whole. So this discussion question response is due Thursday the 21st. You have 48 hours at 1 p.m. But if you need more time, please ask me. I will be happy to give you an extension if you need it. I look forward to reading your responses and beginning to talk about the actual media itself next class. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And if you haven't had a chance to do the textbook readings, please do so that we can begin in earnest next class, and also talk about some of the upcoming assignments where I'm going to have you write journals. These are informal responses of approximately a page or so, talking about each of the major elements of media that we are going to be examining in the class, that I will be grading informally on a checkmark system. And I won't be evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content. And also eventually a final project that we'll be talking about over the course of the semester, but you can begin thinking about now. An element of media that is of interest to you. And I'll be giving some suggested ideas and topics as the semester progresses, but you can begin thinking now about either something we're covering or something we're not covering in relation to media that you would like to examine further, and that would be your final project. So again, how do you think COVID-19 has influenced mass media, and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.